There's a question that shows up at the strangest moments. Not in lecture halls or philosophy classes, it shows up at 3 in the morning when you can't sleep. It shows up in the middle of a perfectly good Tuesday when nothing is actually wrong. It shows up after a funeral, after a breakup, after finishing a series you really loved, and suddenly finding yourself staring at the ceiling. The question is simple, almost embarrassingly simple. What's the point? Not, what's the point of this job or what's the point of this relationship? The full version, what's the point of any of it? What does any of this actually mean? You wake up, you eat, you work, you sleep, you do it again. Civilizations rise and fall. Stars burn out, and at some level, you already know, or at least suspect, that the universe doesn't particularly care. That feeling? That specific kind of vertigo? That's what we're talking about today. Nihilism. From the Latin nihil, nothing. The idea that existence has no inherent meaning, no objective purpose, no ultimate moral truth built into the fabric of the cosmos. That all the values we hold, all the stories we tell ourselves, all the systems we build, political, religious, philosophical, are human constructions, not discoveries, not revelations from on high, just things we made up because we needed them. Now, the word nihilism gets thrown around a lot, and usually carelessly. Someone says nothing matters after a bad day, and their friend says, "Wow, very nihilistic of you." A character in a film is described as a nihilist because they wear black and seem vaguely indifferent to consequences. The word gets used to mean anything from pessimistic to dangerous to too cool to care. But the actual history of this idea, where it came from, how it developed, what it really means, and what human beings have done with it, that's a completely different story. And it's one of the most important intellectual stories of the last 2,000 years. Because nihilism isn't just an edgy posture or an excuse for bad behavior. It's a philosophical problem that civilizations have been wrestling with for millennia. And it's one that hasn't been solved. The people who tried to dismiss it found it waiting for them on the other side. The people who embraced it found it led somewhere very dark. And the people who took it seriously, really seriously, ended up producing some of the most extraordinary and unsettling thinking in the history of human culture. So, let's go all the way back. Not to the word, which came much later, but to the feeling, the doubt, the crack in the foundation. Long before anyone coined the word nihilism, philosophers in ancient Greece were already pulling at the threads that would eventually unravel everything. Start with the Sophists, 5th century BC. Athens is at the height of its power. Democracy is young. Philosophy is fashionable. And into this intellectual scene walk a group of professional thinkers who are willing, for the right fee, to argue any side of any question. Their name has become a slur. We still use sophistry to mean deceptive reasoning, but the Sophists raised questions that were genuinely destabilizing. Protagoras of Abdera, probably the most famous of them, made a claim that sounds simple and is actually radical. Man is the measure of all things. What he meant was that truth is not absolute. Truth is relative to the person perceiving it. What is hot to you might not be hot to me. What is just in Athens might not be just in Persia. There is no cosmic standard against which to measure these things. There's only human judgment. This was alarming to Plato, who spent much of his career trying to refute it. And it alarmed him for good reason, because if Protagoras is right, if all values and truths are relative to the human doing the measuring, then the foundations of morality, law, and meaning start to wobble. Then there's Pyrrho of Elis, late 4th century BC. He's often called the father of skepticism, and his position was even more radical. Pyrrho argued that we cannot know anything with certainty, not because we're stupid, but because our senses and our reasoning are fundamentally unreliable. For every argument, there is an equal counter-argument. For every apparent truth, there is doubt. His solution? Suspend judgment. Don't commit to any belief. Achieve a state of inner calm, ataraxia, by letting go of the compulsive need to know. His followers took this further. The Pyrrhonists, as they became known, developed elaborate techniques for demolishing any claim to knowledge. And here's the thing, they were very good at it. Greek philosophy produced some of the sharpest logical minds in history, and the Pyrrhonists aimed all that sharpness directly at the idea that anything could be known or proven. Now, they weren't quite nihilists in the modern sense. They weren't saying nothing matters, they were saying we can't know what matters. But that's only one step away. If you can't know what's true or what's good, if every moral claim can be dismantled by a sufficiently clever argument, then you're already standing at the edge of the void. There's another figure worth mentioning here, though he rarely gets credit as a Platonialist. Epicurus, also of the 4th century BC, proposed something that sounded calming and was actually quite shocking. He argued that the gods exist but don't care about us. That the universe operates on purely material principles, atoms and void, that when we die, we simply cease to exist. There's no afterlife, no judgment, no cosmic accounting. Death, he said, is nothing to us, because when death is, we are not. And when we are, death is not. For most people in the ancient world, this was terrifying. The entire moral and social order was held together by the idea that the gods were watching, that good and evil had consequences beyond death, that the universe had a moral structure. Epicurus quietly dissolved that structure and replaced it with atoms and void. It's a universe without inherent meaning, held together only by what gives us pleasure and frees us from pain. And then there's Lucretius, the Roman poet who took Epicureanism and turned it into literature. His poem, De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, is one of the greatest philosophical works in the Latin language. And at its core is the argument that the universe is purely physical, that consciousness is a product of matter, and that human significance in the cosmos is essentially nil. He didn't despair about this. Lucretius found it liberating. If there's no divine plan, then we're free. But the intellectual path he opened, the universe as a meaningless machine, would take on very different emotional tones in later centuries. What these ancient thinkers share is the impulse to question the ground beneath our feet. Not necessarily to destroy meaning, but to ask whether it has any foundation that isn't human-made. And that question, once asked honestly, never fully goes away. After the fall of Rome, European philosophy took a long detour. Not that philosophy stopped happening, it didn't. But for roughly 1,000 years, the dominant framework in Europe was Christian theology. And within that framework, the questions the ancient skeptics had raised were essentially off the table. The question, does anything matter? Had a ready answer? Yes, everything matters, because God made everything and watches everything and judges everything. The question, is there objective moral truth? Had a ready answer? Yes. It's in the Bible and in the teachings of the Church. This wasn't intellectual cowardice. The medieval scholastics, Thomas Aquinas, Duns, Scotus, William of Ockham, were brilliant, rigorous thinkers. They engaged seriously with the hardest philosophical questions, but they engaged within a framework that took the existence of God as the starting assumption, not the conclusion. God was the bedrock. Everything else was built on top of it. In that structure, nihilism isn't really possible. If God exists and created the universe with purpose and provides moral law, then meaning is not in question, it's guaranteed. You might doubt this or that doctrine, but the basic fact that existence has meaning and human action matters to a divine judge, that was not up for debate in the mainstream. Intellectual culture? The crack that would eventually split this framework open came from an unexpected direction. William of Ockham, in the 14th century, developed a position called voluntarism. God's will, he argued, is not constrained by rational necessity. God could have made cruelty good and kindness evil if he'd wanted to. Morality isn't built into the structure of reality, it's decreed by divine will. This was meant to protect God's omnipotence, but it had a terrifying implication. If God's will is the only source of moral value, then moral value is, in some sense, arbitrary. It could have been otherwise. And if it could have been otherwise, the question of whether it was correctly arranged becomes live. This is a thread, and once you pull it, history starts to unravel. The 17th and 18th centuries changed everything. The scientific revolution produced Newton's mechanics, a picture of the universe as a vast law-governed machine operating on mathematical principles. It was magnificent. It was also deeply impersonal. A Newtonian universe has no purpose baked into it. It has causes and effects. It has laws of motion. What it doesn't obviously have is meaning. The Enlightenment ran with this. Reason, not revelation, became the standard for truth. The great project was to subject everything, politics, morality, religion, human nature, to rational scrutiny. And rational scrutiny is a powerful solvent. It dissolves a lot of things that used to seem solid. David Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher, was one of the most devastating thinkers in this tradition. He demonstrated, with surgical precision, that you cannot derive moral facts from factual observations. Just because something is a certain way doesn't tell you how it ought to be. This is now called the is-out gap, and it's a fundamental problem for any attempt to ground morality in nature or reason alone. If morality can't be derived from facts, and it can't be derived from revelation because Hume was also deeply skeptical about miracles and religious knowledge, then where does it come from? Where is it written? Hume's answer was human sentiment. We're social creatures. We feel sympathy. Morality is the codification of those feelings. It works well enough, but it has no cosmic backing. It's not discovered in the stars. It's invented by human beings and sustained by human agreement. This is not quite nihilism. Hume wasn't saying nothing matters. He was saying mattersness comes from us, not from the universe. But it's a crucial shift. It moves the source of meaning from the cosmos to the human mind. And once that move is made, the next question is obvious. What if the human mind is unreliable? What if our moral feelings are just evolutionary adaptations, or cultural programming, or class interests dressed up as ethics? At the same time, something was happening in France that would give these intellectual doubts explosive political force. The Enlightenment produced the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, in its most radical phases, produced a systematic attempt to destroy the old values, the church, the monarchy, the aristocracy, and replace them with reason itself. The revolutionaries renamed the months, replaced religious holidays with civic ones, turned Notre Dame Cathedral into a temple of reason. And then the guillotine started running. And the terror began. And suddenly, the great project of applying pure reason to human affairs started to look less like liberation and more like something else entirely. The most rational revolution in history produced one of the bloodiest periods in European memory. Edmund Burke in England watched this happen and wrote reflections on the revolution in France, arguing that human societies can't survive the wholesale destruction of inherited values and traditions. You can't just tear everything down and build from pure reason. Something essential is lost. But the revolutionaries were onto something too. The old values, the divine right of kings, the religious justification for hierarchy, the God-given nature of suffering, those were fictions, powerful fictions, fictions that people had died for and killed for. And once you see them as fictions, you can't unsee it. This is the moment, roughly, when nihilism as a concept starts to become thinkable, not just as a philosophical position, but as a cultural and political force. The word itself, let's pin it down. The term nihilism appears in modern European philosophy, most prominently in the work of Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, a German philosopher writing at the end of the 18th century. In a letter from 1799, and in subsequent writings, Jacobi used the term to attack the rationalist philosophy of his contemporaries, particularly Kant and Fichte. His argument was this: if you take reason all the way to its logical conclusion, if you really follow the Enlightenment project to its end, you don't arrive at firm foundations. You arrive at nothing. Because reason, taken seriously, can always ask one more question. It can dissolve any foundation. It can question any assumption. The result is nihilism, a void at the heart of rationalist philosophy. Jacobi meant this as a criticism. He was arguing for faith, for revelation, for something that could stop the regress of skeptical questioning. He thought rationalism was self-undermining, but in naming the problem, he also named the possibility. Nihilism became a word for a real thing. Other German idealist philosophers engaged with the problem too. Schelling, Hegel, Fichte, all of them, in different ways, were trying to answer the nihilist challenge. How do you ground meaning, value, and purpose if you've abandoned God and can't fully trust reason? The whole edifice of German idealism is, in a sense, an elaborate attempt to fill the void that the Enlightenment had excavated. But the void had a way of growing back. Friedrich Nietzsche, decades later, would say that this entire project, trying to salvage meaning from a universe without God, trying to find secular foundations for moral values, was doomed. Not because it was stupid, but because the people attempting it hadn't been honest about what they were actually doing. They were trying to keep the fruits of Christianity, human dignity, objective morality, progressive history, without keeping the tree, and the fruits would rot without the tree. That insight is still one of the most challenging things ever written in philosophy. But we'll get there. The word nihilism might have been born in German philosophy, but it got its first real cultural life in Russia. In 1862, Ivan Turgenev published Fathers and Sons in Russian, Fathers and Children. It's a novel about generational conflict, about the clash between the old liberal aristocratic culture of Russia and the new radical young intelligentsia who wanted to tear everything down. The central character is Bazarov, a young medical student with a swagger and a contempt for everything that preceded him. He rejects art, aesthetics, sentiment, political liberalism, aristocratic values, and religion. He believes only in what can be empirically verified and materially useful. He is the novel's nihilist. Turgenev didn't invent the word, but he popularized it. Bazarov gave nihilist a face, a personality, an attitude, and that attitude caught fire among the Russian radical youth of the 1860s. Real Russian nihilists didn't quite match Bazarov, but there was a genuine movement. The Russian nihilists were materialists, anti-authoritarians, and radicals. They believed that Russian society, its religion, its monarchy, its serfdom, its cultural traditions was so corrupt and hollow that it needed to be completely demolished before anything worthwhile could be built. They were the ultimate children of the Enlightenment. Trust only what you can verify, reject what you cannot justify. Some of them were deeply serious thinkers. Nikolai Chernyshevsky, whose novel What is to be Done became a kind of Bible for the Russian radical left, argued for a rational egoism, the idea that human beings should act in ways that maximize their genuine self-interest, which would naturally align with collective good. It sounds dry, but it was incendiary. Lenin read it and said it transformed him. Others moved from philosophical nihilism to actual terrorism. The group Narodnaya Volya People's Will assassinated Tsar Alexander II in 1881 by throwing bombs at his carriage. The Tsar, who had actually freed the serfs, was blown apart by the radicals who wanted to blow everything up. This is the first time nihilism becomes genuinely dangerous in a political sense. Not just as a philosophical position, but as an operational ideology. If existing values are worthless and existing institutions are rotten, then violence against them isn't murder, it's cleansing. It's the necessary fire. This connection between nihilism and political violence would haunt the 20th century. And it wasn't lost on Fyodor Dostoevsky. Fyodor Dostoevsky hated nihilism, and hating it gave him some of the greatest novels ever written. Dostoevsky was himself a former radical. In his youth, he attended meetings of the Petroshevsky Circle, a group of idealistic intellectuals who discussed utopian socialism and social reform. In 1849, he was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death. He was brought to the execution site, the sentence was read, and then, at the last moment, as a deliberate act of psychological torture, the Tsar commuted the sentence to hard labor in Siberia. That experience broke Dostoevsky and remade him. He came out of Siberia a Christian, a conservative, and an implacable opponent of the rational utopias that had enchanted him in his youth. His novels are philosophical arguments disguised as fiction. Crime and Punishment, published in 1866, is almost a direct response to Bazarov and to the nihilism of the Russian radicals. Its central character, Raskolnikov, has convinced himself through a kind of proto-nihilist reasoning that conventional morality doesn't apply to exceptional people, to those like Napoleon, who are strong enough to transcend ordinary rules. He decides to prove this to himself by murdering a pawnbroker whom he considers useless and parasitic. The murder goes badly. He kills not just the pawnbroker, but her half-sister who witnesses it, and then, even though he isn't caught, he falls apart. Not because of legal consequences, but because of psychological ones. The rational framework he built to justify the murder collapses under the weight of the actual experience. The abstraction and the reality are completely different things. Dostoevsky's argument is this: the nihilist project, the attempt to live outside conventional values by pure rational self-interest or pure will, fails. At the level of lived experience, human beings are not rational machines. They are moral beings with deep psychological needs for meaning, connection, guilt, and redemption. You can't think your way out of your own humanity. Then came The Possessed, published in 1872, also known as Demons or Devils. It's based on a real event, a murder carried out by a nihilist cell, and it's Dostoevsky's most direct attack on radical nihilism. One of the characters, Pyotr Verkovensky, is a monster of pure revolutionary energy, willing to use, manipulate, and destroy anyone in service of the revolution. Another, Stavrogin, is the image of a man who has genuinely transcended conventional morality and found nothing on the other side. Not freedom, nothing. There's a moment in The Possessed where a character named Kirillov, a man who has concluded that there is no God and that human freedom requires proving this by suicide, chooses to kill himself in order to demonstrate freedom. It's one of the most chilling sequences in literature, and Dostoevsky intends it as a demonstration that nihilism, taken to its logical conclusion, leads not to liberation but to death. The Brothers Karamazov, his final novel, restates the problem with maximum force. Ivan Karamazov, the intellectual brother, articulates the case for atheism and meaninglessness with such power and precision that readers sometimes forget it's supposed to be the losing argument. His Grand Inquisitor is one of the greatest monologues in fiction, but Ivan's position leads him to madness. His everything is permitted becomes the justification for a murder. And yet Dostoevsky's answer, faith, love, Christian humility, didn't fully satisfy everyone, because the nihilist critique of religion and meaning was philosophically quite strong. Dostoevsky could show you where nihilism led. He couldn't fully rebut the argument. That would take someone who walked into the problem from the other direction entirely. Before Nietzsche, there was Schopenhauer, and to understand Nietzsche, you need to spend some time with the man who most influenced him. Arthur Schopenhauer was a 19th century German philosopher who had one great idea and spent his entire career elaborating it. The idea was this: behind the world of appearances, behind everything we perceive through our senses and our reason, there is a single, blind, purposeless, striving force. He called it the will, not will in the sense of conscious intention. Will as pure, mindless drive. The force that makes organisms grow and compete and reproduce and die. The force that makes the universe tick. The will, Schopenhauer argued, doesn't care about you. It doesn't care about humanity. It doesn't care about beauty or justice or love. It just strives, endlessly, pointlessly, without goal or direction. And human beings are just temporary expressions of this force. We suffer, we desire, we achieve, we desire again, we age, we die, and the will doesn't notice. This is one of the bleakest philosophical visions in Western thought. Schopenhauer was deeply influenced by Buddhist philosophy, by the idea that desire is the root of suffering, that existence is characterized by dukkha, by unsatisfactoriness. His version was even darker than the Buddhist original because he didn't have a path out. The Buddhist response to suffering is the cessation of desire, the achievement of nirvana. Schopenhauer didn't quite believe in that. The best you could do was temporarily silence the will through aesthetic experience, especially music, or through ascetic self-denial, but you couldn't escape it. It always came back. His major work, The World as Will and Representation, published in 1818, was largely ignored for decades. Then, in the second half of the 19th century, it became enormously fashionable. Artists and writers and composers read it and found in it a philosophical vocabulary for their own darkest feelings. Wagner adored it, Thomas Hardy was influenced by it. It became the intellectual soundtrack for a certain kind of European cultural pessimism, and it directly shaped Friedrich Nietzsche, who started out as one of Schopenhauer's most devoted disciples and ended up as his most ferocious critic. Because Nietzsche looked at Schopenhauer's vision and said, "Yes, you got something right, but your response is wrong. Pessimism is not an answer. Resignation is not an answer. The question is whether human beings can face the truth about existence and still affirm life." That question is what Nietzsche spent his career trying to answer. And it's still one of the most important questions in the history of philosophy. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in Prussia, the son of a Lutheran pastor who died when Nietzsche was 4. He was a prodigy. He was reading Greek at 14, writing philosophy and poetry before 20. He was appointed professor of classical philology at the University of Basel at 24, before he'd even finished his doctorate. He was extraordinary. He was also deeply strange, physically frail, plagued by migraines and eye problems, socially awkward, capable of extraordinary tenderness and extraordinary cruelty. He had a famous friendship and falling out with Wagner. He lived as a wandering scholar, moving between boarding houses in Switzerland, Italy, and France. He had no stable home, no permanent relationships, no institutional backing. He wrote books and they went unread. And he wrote some of the most important philosophy of the 19th century. The single image most associated with Nietzsche is the madman in the marketplace from his book, The Gay Science, published in 1882. A madman lights a lantern in the morning, runs to the marketplace, and cries, "I am looking for God. I am looking for God." The people around him, who don't believe in God anyway, laugh at him. And then he says, "God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him." This is one of the most misunderstood passages in philosophy. People hear it as Nietzsche saying atheism is correct, or religion is stupid, or even as some kind of celebration. It's none of those things. What Nietzsche is saying is something far more serious. He's saying that the entire moral, cultural, and metaphysical framework that Western civilization had built over 2,000 years was collapsing. Not just the church, not just the idea of a personal God, but everything the idea of God had supported: objective moral law, the intrinsic worth of the individual human being, the teleological sense that history is going somewhere, the idea that suffering has meaning, the notion that truth is absolute. The madman continues. What was holiest and most powerful of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? And then he says something that is the key to the whole passage. This tremendous event is still on its way. The light of the stars requires time. The deeds require time, even after they are done, before they can be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. The people in the marketplace don't feel the weight of what they've done. They've abandoned belief in God as if it were a trivial thing, a superstition they outgrew. They don't understand that they've pulled out the foundation of their entire civilization. The consequences haven't arrived yet, but they will. This is not atheism as a comfortable position. This is atheism as a catastrophe. And Nietzsche is one of the very few people in the 19th century who grasped the full magnitude of what the death of God actually implied. Nietzsche's diagnosis of his civilization was brutally clear. Europe was in the grip of nihilism. But not the aggressive, revolutionary nihilism of the Russian radicals. Something quieter and more insidious. He called it passive nihilism. And he saw it everywhere. Passive nihilism is what happens when people have lost their faith in transcendent values, in God, in absolute truth, in cosmic purpose, but haven't found anything to put in their place. They don't rage against the void. They just deflate. Life loses its flavor. Energy drains away. Nothing seems worth fighting for. The future seems no better or worse than the present. He saw this in the exhausted liberalism of his time. He saw it in the growing vogue for Schopenhauer's pessimism. He saw it in the comfortable bourgeois culture that was the dominant tone of European life in the second half of the 19th century, a culture of mild pleasures, small ambitions, decent comfort, and deep, unacknowledged meaninglessness. The figure he invented to capture this was the last man. The last man appears in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, published in the 1880s. The last man is the person at the end of history, the person who has solved the problem of life by making it very, very small. The last man wants comfort. The last man wants safety. The last man has invented happiness, a little warmth, a little pleasure, no great striving, no great suffering, no ambition, no vision. We have invented happiness. The last men blink. This figure is meant to horrify you. Nietzsche considered the last man the most contemptible possibility for human existence. Not because the last man was immoral, because the last man was empty, a human life shrunk down to nothing but the minimal maintenance of existence. Look at certain strains of contemporary consumer culture, and you can see exactly what Nietzsche was afraid of. The endless comfort, the curated pleasures, the algorithmic feeds optimized for mild engagement, the retreat from anything demanding or difficult or genuinely risky. The last man is not a monster. He's worse than a monster. He's content. But passive nihilism was only one problem. There was also active nihilism, and that was different. Active nihilism, in Nietzsche's framework, is what happens when the response to the death of God is not deflation but destruction. If the old values are gone, then tear everything down. Make the void visible. The Russian revolutionaries, the anarchists, the bomb throwers, these were active nihilists in his sense. Nietzsche had a complicated relationship with this. He understood it. He could see the energy in it. The destruction of false values isn't nothing, it's something, and sometimes it's necessary. But he didn't think destruction was enough. You couldn't build on nothing. You couldn't create meaning out of pure negation. What he proposed instead was the hardest possible response. The Übermensch, usually translated as Superman or Overman. This has been massively misunderstood. Nietzsche was not talking about a race of biological superiors. He specifically mocked German nationalism and anti-Semitism. His sister, Elisabeth Farster-Nietzsche, who controlled his literary estate after his mental collapse, deliberately distorted his work to make it compatible with German nationalism, a betrayal that Nietzsche himself had predicted and feared. The Übermensch is not a race, it's a possibility. The possibility of a human being who creates values rather than inheriting them, who faces the full truth about existence, its randomness, its cruelty, its indifference, and responds not with despair, not with deflation, not with destruction, but with affirmation, with the will to create meaning. This is an extraordinary ask. Nietzsche knew it was extraordinary. He was not proposing a comfortable philosophy. He was proposing that a small number of exceptional individuals could become the source of new values after the collapse of the old ones. Not God-given values. Not natural law. But genuinely created values. The product of an exceptional human will. The test he proposed for this kind of affirmation was what he called the eternal recurrence. Not as a scientific hypothesis, but as a thought experiment that he immediately transformed into something else. He asked, if you had to live this life exactly as it is, every moment repeated infinitely forever, would you say yes? Could you will it? Could you love it? Most people, faced with that question, feel something shrink inside them. The answer, honestly, is no. There are too many regrets, too much suffering, too much meaningless waste. The eternal recurrence test reveals how much of life most people merely endure rather than affirm. The Übermensch is the person who could say yes, who could will the eternal recurrence of their life without flinching. That's the standard. And it is, deliberately, very high. Whether Nietzsche's solution to nihilism actually works is a question philosophers have been arguing about for 140 years. But the problem he identified, the collapse of transcendent meaning in a world without God, is as real today as it was in 1882. In January 1889, Friedrich Nietzsche collapsed in a street in Turin. He had reportedly thrown his arms around the neck of a horse, being beaten by its coachman. He was carried back to his boarding house. He never recovered his sanity. He spent the last 11 years of his life in a condition of mental incapacity, cared for first by his mother and then by his sister. What exactly happened to him is still debated. Syphilitic dementia, frontotemporal dementia, a brain tumor, the diagnoses range. What is certain is that one of the most acute and demanding minds of the 19th century simply switched off. And the man who had confronted the full horror of nihilism with such fierce intelligence spent his last decade unable to think at all. His sister Elizabeth took control of his unpublished manuscripts and his literary estate. She was a committed German nationalist and anti-Semite, everything her brother had mocked and despised, and she edited his work accordingly. She constructed the image of a Nietzsche who supported German nationalism, who celebrated strength as racial purity, who could be read as a precursor to Nazi ideology. This was a catastrophic misrepresentation. When the Nazis came to power, they embraced the distorted Nietzsche. Hitler visited the Nietzsche archive. Mussolini called himself a Nietzschean. The philosophy meant to overcome nihilism was conscripted into one of history's greatest exercises in nihilistic destruction. The rehabilitation of the real Nietzsche, the anti-nationalist, the critic of German chauvinism, the one who wrote, "I am not a man, I am dynamite," but meant it philosophically, took decades and is, in some circles, still ongoing. But here's what's important. Even the distorted, weaponized Nietzsche had captured something real. The death of God left a vacuum. And into that vacuum, in the 20th century, rushed some of the most violent political movements in human history. Nietzsche had warned that this would happen. He'd described what a civilization looks like when it loses its moral center. He just didn't have a good enough solution to prevent it. The 20th century was what that looks like in practice. August 1914, Europe goes to war, and nothing is ever the same. The First World War is one of the most significant cultural and philosophical events in modern history. Not just because of the casualties, though there were roughly 17 million dead. Not just because of the physical destruction, but because of what it did to the story Europe told about itself. The 19th century had, by and large, believed in progress. Not naively, there were plenty of critics, but the dominant intellectual culture of the Victorian and Edwardian era believed that civilization was improving, science was advancing, democracy was spreading, living standards were rising, humanity was on an upward trajectory. The war destroyed that story. The men who went to the front went with flags and bands and speeches about duty and glory. They went with the inherited moral vocabulary of their civilization: honor, sacrifice, the rightness of the cause, the Christian assurance that God watched over the good and punished the wicked, and they found barbed wire, and machine guns, and artillery barrages that lasted for days, and turned the landscape into a moonscape of mud and shattered trees and body parts. The Battle of the Somme, on its first day, July 1st, 1916, saw nearly 60,000 British casualties. In a single day, Wilfred Owen's poem Duceat Decorum Est. The title is from a Horace ode meaning, "It is sweet and proper to die for one's country," is the most famous piece of anti-war writing in English. Owen describes a gas attack, a man dying from mustard gas, the narrator unable to help, and then addresses the reader directly. "If you could see what I have seen, you would not tell the children that it is sweet and proper to die for one's country. You would not call it the old lie, the old lie." The inherited moral framework, the story that made sacrifice meaningful, the idea that civilization was worth dying for, all of it called into question by the reality on the ground. The soldiers who survived came home changed. The war generation, the lost generation, as Gertrude Stein called the Americans who stayed in Paris after the war, were marked by a profound disenchantment. They had seen too much. The old values rang hollow. The church, the nation, the idea of honor, these things had led their friends to die in a muddy trench for a few hundred yards of Belgian ground. Ernest Hemingway captured this in The Sun Also Rises. In 1926, Jake Barnes and his friends live in Paris and Pamplona drinking, watching bullfights, engaging in complicated romantic entanglements, doing everything except addressing the wound at the center of their lives. The prose is deliberately empty of moral commentary. Things happen, they are felt, they are not explained because there is no explanation. The old moral vocabulary has been surrendered. The war didn't create nihilism, but it gave nihilism a mass audience. For the first time, a generation of ordinary people, not just philosophers and artists, had experienced the full arbitrariness of existence, the randomness of death, the hollow cruelty of the structures that demanded their sacrifice. The existential crisis that 19th century philosophers had been writing about in books had arrived in the trenches of Flanders. While the guns were still firing, a group of artists in Zurich, neutral Switzerland, the one country in Europe that had managed to stay out of the war, decided that if civilization had produced this catastrophe, then civilization was a fraud. The Cabaret Voltaire, which opened in February 1916, was the birthplace of Dada. The name itself was chosen precisely because it meant nothing. Dada is a French child's word for a hobby horse, or possibly just a random sound. The meaninglessness of the name was the point. Hugo Ball, Emmy Hennings, Tristan Zara, Jean Arp. These artists and writers gathered in Zurich to make art that attacked art, to perform poetry that wasn't poetry, to produce manifestos that undermined the idea of manifestos. They read nonsense poetry, phoneme sequences with no semantic content. They created collages by cutting up newspaper articles and letting the pieces fall randomly. They staged simultaneous poems where multiple readers spoke in different languages at the same time, creating pure noise. The logic was impeccable, in its way. If Western culture and reason had produced the world that sent 19-year-old boys to drown in mud, then reason itself was the problem. Art that made sense, that participated in the aesthetic tradition of Western civilization, was complicit. Only nonsense was honest. Dada spread to Berlin, Paris, and New York. In Berlin, it took on a more explicitly political edge. The Berlin Dadaists were angry in ways the Zurich founders weren't. In Paris, it evolved into surrealism, which retained the irrationalism but added a positive program, the liberation of the unconscious. But pure Dada at its core was nihilism as aesthetic practice, and it was serious. It asked a question that hadn't been asked quite so directly before. What is art for, in a world where culture has demonstrably failed? Later movements, abstract expressionism, punk, certain strains of conceptual art would return to this question again and again. The Dada answer, nothing. It's for nothing. Look at this nonsense proved surprisingly durable. The 1920s and 1930s were not kind to the project of meaning-making. In Germany, the trauma of the war was compounded by the humiliating Peace of Versailles, hyperinflation that wiped out the savings of the middle class, the political chaos of the Weimar Republic, and then the rise of the National Socialists. In Russia, the revolution had produced not the rational utopia the nihilists had dreamed of, but a one-party state under Stalin that murdered its citizens by the millions. In the United States, the Jazz Age prosperity collapsed into the Great Depression. Against this background, a new philosophical movement emerged in Europe that took nihilism seriously as the starting point and tried to find a way forward from it. Existentialism. The word is associated primarily with Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir in France, but its roots go back further, to the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard in the 19th century and to the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who published his monumental Being and Time in 1927. Heidegger is one of the most important and most complicated thinkers of the 20th century. He was trying to ask, with total seriousness, the question that the whole philosophical tradition had apparently overlooked. What is being? Not what are beings, chairs, trees, people, atoms, but what is the nature of existence itself? What does it mean for something to be? His answer was dense to the point of opacity, and has generated libraries of commentary. But one aspect of it bears directly on nihilism. Heidegger argued that human beings, Dasein, as he called us, being there, are thrown into existence. We don't choose to exist. We don't choose our time, our place, our body, our culture. We find ourselves already here, always already in a situation not of our making, and we know we will die. The awareness of death is not an accident of human consciousness, it is constitutive of it. What makes human existence specifically human is this constant horizon of mortality. And here's the point. For Heidegger, inauthentic existence is the default. Most people, most of the time, flee from the reality of their own mortality and their own fundamental groundlessness by losing themselves in the they, das Man, the anonymous social self. You do what one does, you think what one thinks, you feel what one feels. You don't confront your own existence directly. You hide in social roles and conventions and shared assumptions. Authentic existence requires confronting the nothingness at the core of your situation, acknowledging that you will die, that your existence is not guaranteed by any external structure, that you are responsible for your own being in a way that cannot be delegated to God or tradition or society. This is not exactly nihilism, but it starts from a similar place, the collapse of external guarantees, the absence of inherent meaning, and asks what a genuinely human response to that situation looks like. Heidegger's personal life was, it must be said, a catastrophe. He joined the Nazi Party in 1933. His rector's address at Freiburg University is an embarrassing document of philosophical collaboration with fascism. He never fully recanted. The man who wrote most penetratingly about authentic existence proved spectacularly incapable of achieving it himself. This contradiction has troubled philosophy students ever since, and rightly so. Jean-Paul Sartre took Heidegger's insights, stripped out the mystical language, and presented them in a form that could actually be communicated to a general audience. Sartre's central slogan is "Existence precedes essence." What this means is almost the opposite of the traditional view of things. In the traditional view, things have an essence, a nature, a purpose, a definition before they exist. A knife is designed to cut before any particular knife is made. The blueprints precede the object. For human beings, in the traditional religious view, the same logic applies. God designed human nature, determined human purpose, before creating any individual human being. Your essence, what you are, what you're for, precedes your existence. Sartre says this is exactly backwards for human beings. We exist first, without a predetermined nature or purpose. Then, through our choices and actions, we create ourselves. There is no human nature, no divine blueprint, no essence waiting to be discovered. There's only what you do with the life you're given. The implications are radical. If there is no predetermined human nature, then there's no escaping responsibility for what you are. You can't say that's just the way I am, or that's what God made me, or that's what my class or my upbringing made me. Those things influence you, but they don't determine you. Every moment, you are choosing, and in choosing, you are creating yourself. And in creating yourself, you bear full responsibility for the creation. This is what Sartre calls radical freedom, and it sounds liberating, but he immediately points out that it's also terrifying. He calls this terror, anxiety, angoisse, the anxiety of freedom, the recognition that there is no script, no safety net of cosmic meaning, no God to blame or credit for how your life turns out. People flee this anxiety constantly. Sartre calls the flight bad faith, mauvaise foi. Bad faith is pretending you don't have freedom, you actually have. It's the waiter who performs the role of waiter so perfectly, so completely, that he seems to believe that's all he is, not a free being who chooses to be a waiter, but a thing that is a waiter. It's the person who says, I couldn't do anything else, it's just who I am. It's the construction of a false necessity where there is only choice. Sartre's philosophical novel Nausea, published in 1938, before the war, captured the existentialist mood better than any work of philosophy. Its protagonist, Roquentin, is a man who begins to experience the sheer contingency of existence as a physical sensation. Nausea, things, including himself, appear as simply and absolutely existing, without reason or necessity, without essence or meaning. The bare factness of existence, stripped of all the narratives we drape over it. It's one of the most philosophically honest pieces of fiction ever written, and it's deeply uncomfortable to read. After the Second World War, which we'll get to, Sartre became the most famous intellectual in the world. His cafes in Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris became the unofficial headquarters of European philosophy. His concept of existentialist freedom became the philosophical mood music of the post-war generation. The people who had survived the war and the Holocaust and the total moral catastrophe of the 20th century found in Sartre a philosophy that started from the ruins and tried to build something human in the middle of them. Albert Camus was Sartre's friend, then his antagonist, then his permanent point of contrast. They agreed on the diagnosis and disagreed on the cure, which is part of what made both of them so interesting. Camus was born in 1913 in Algeria, then a French colony, to a working-class family. His father was killed in the First World War when Camus was less than a year old. He grew up in poverty, won a scholarship, studied philosophy, contracted tuberculosis, recovered, and became a journalist and writer. He died in a car accident in 1960 at the age of 46, and the world was genuinely diminished. His key concept is the absurd, and unlike some philosophical concepts, the absurd is quite precisely defined. The absurd is not a property of the world, and it's not a property of the human mind. It's the relationship between the two. Human beings, Camus observed, have an insatiable need for clarity, for meaning, for coherence, for an answer to the question why. It's not something we can turn off. The demand for meaning is constitutive of human consciousness. We need the world to make sense. The world does not make sense. It's silent on the question of meaning. It offers no answers. It kills the innocent and rewards the cruel and ends everyone's story with death. and it doesn't explain itself. The tension between the human need for meaning and the world's silence, that's the absurd. And Camus argued that it is the fundamental fact of human existence. You can't eliminate it by finding God. That would be a philosophical leap of faith, a kind of suicide of reason. And you can't eliminate it by killing yourself. That would be physical suicide, which removes the person who felt the absurd but doesn't answer it. The only honest response is to live with it, to acknowledge it fully and still say yes to life. He called this revolt, not the political kind, but an existential one. The refusal to be crushed by the absurd, the insistence on living fully in the knowledge that life has no transcendent meaning. His image for this is Sisyphus. In Greek mythology, Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to push a boulder up a hill, watch it roll back down, and push it up again forever. Camus took this as the image of human existence, the endless, pointless repetition of effort without final achievement. And then he said something that surprised everyone. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, not pretend he's happy, not force happiness onto a terrible situation, but genuinely, authentically imagine the possibility that a man who has acknowledged the full hopelessness of his task, who has no illusions, who is fully lucid about his condition, that such a man might, in the actual moment of labor, find something. The rocks, the sky, the effort of his body, the texture of the thing itself. Camus was not offering comfort. He was suggesting that the absurd, fully embraced rather than fled from, might have a different quality than the abyss it first appears to be. This is not the same as nihilism. It starts from the same place, the collapse of transcendent meaning, but it arrives somewhere different, not at nothing, at something His novel, The Stranger, published in 1942, is one of the most read novels of the 20th century. Its protagonist, Merceau, is an Algerian clerk who shoots an Arab man on a beach without, apparently, understanding why. His subsequent trial is not really about the murder, it's about his failure to cry at his mother's funeral, his failure to perform the emotional gestures that would make him socially legible. He is condemned not for the crime, but for his refusal to perform meaning. He is a man who takes the absurd seriously, who doesn't pretend. And in the last pages, facing execution, he opens himself to the gentle indifference of the world and finds something like peace. Camus won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1957. He remains one of the most read and most personally beloved of all modern writers. There's something in his voice, lucid, humane, precise. Not quite hopeful, but not quite hopeless either, that speaks to people across generations. And then there was the Second World War, the Holocaust. 60 million dead globally. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the discovery of the full scale of the Nazi extermination program, the Gulag Archipelago, the atomic age. The First World War had shattered the story of progress. The Second World War shattered the floor itself. After Auschwitz, as the German philosopher Theodor Adorno wrote, to write poetry is barbaric. He didn't mean it was literally impossible. He meant that the civilizational complacencies that had supported the tradition of European poetry and culture, the implicit assumption that things were, broadly speaking, moving toward the good, that assumption was ash. Hannah Arendt's coverage of the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief administrators of the Holocaust, produced one of the most disturbing concepts in 20th century thought, the banality of evil. Eichmann was not a monster. He was not a sadist. He was a bureaucrat. He organized the logistics of genocide with the same mentality one might apply to any large organizational problem. He followed orders. He performed his role. He never, apparently, stepped back to consider the full moral weight of what he was administering. The horror of this was not that evil is spectacular. It's that evil can be ordinary. That ordinary people, in the wrong system, performing the wrong roles, can participate in the worst atrocities imaginable and feel nothing in particular about it. That the moral sensibility can be entirely switched off by the mechanism of bureaucratic role performance. This connects back to the nihilist problem. If values are not objective, not built into the cosmos, if they're human constructions, then under sufficiently abnormal conditions, they can be overridden. A whole civilization can redirect itself toward mass murder and justify it with perfectly coherent internal logic. Sartre's bad faith, taken at scale. A whole culture performing its role without asking the question that has to be asked. Viktor Frankl, a Viennese psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz and Dachau, Published, Man's Search for Meaning in 1946. His response to the nihilist problem was direct. Meaning is not discovered, it's created. In the most extreme conditions imaginable, the concentration camp. The total destruction of all external structures, human beings retain the capacity to choose their response. The last of human freedoms. Frankl called it the freedom to choose one's attitude toward the situation, whatever the situation is. This is not exactly Nietzsche, it's not exactly Camus, but it's in the same family. The insistence that even in the void, something remains. Not a god, not a cosmic plan, but the irreducible human capacity to make meaning. The question is whether that capacity is enough. After the war, something unusual happened. Philosophy got young. In the late 1940s and into the 1950s, a group of writers in the United States started doing in fiction and poetry what Sartre and Camus had been doing in philosophy, stripping away the inherited moral framework and asking what a genuinely free life looked like. The Beats, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, Neil Casati, Gregory Corso, Lawrence Ferlinghetti. They came mostly from the Northeast, New York, Massachusetts, but found their spiritual home in San Francisco. They were attracted to jazz, to Buddhism, to drugs, to the open road, to anything that seemed to break the sealed, suffocating conformity of post-war American life. Kerouac's On the Road, published in 1957, became one of the defining texts of a generation. It's not a nihilist novel, exactly. The Beats were not nihilists in the pure sense. They were more like existentialists of the American variety. People who believed that authentic experience mattered, that the bourgeois conformity of American life was a kind of death, that the intensity of being fully alive was worth more than safety and respectability. But there was a nihilist undercurrent, the Beats' celebration of spontaneity, of living entirely in the present, of rejecting social obligation. These were ways of dealing with the fact that the inherited meaning structures had collapsed. If God is dead and civilization is a fraud, what do? You drive fast and write about it. Ginsberg's Howl, published in 1956, opens with one of the great first lines in American poetry. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. It's an elegy for the casualties of the post-war order. The people who couldn't or wouldn't conform, who were institutionalized, criminalized, dismissed. It's an expression of rage at the cost of enforced meaning. Burroughs was the darkest of the group. His Naked Lunch, published in 1959, has almost no plot. It's a collage of hallucinatory vignettes, deliberately resistant to linear narrative, deliberately resisting the consolations of storytelling. The book performs the fragmentation of meaning rather than just describing it. It was obscene. It was brilliant. It was deeply unsettling. The Beats were enormously influential on the generation that followed the baby boomers who came of age in the 60s. And the 60s took the Beats' restlessness and turned it into a mass movement. The 1960s are the decade that the 20th century argues about most. In the United States and the United Kingdom, a generation came of age under the shadow of nuclear annihilation, the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the constant low hum of existential threat. They also came of age during the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and the Sexual Revolution. Everything was unstable. Everything was in question. The cultural mood was simultaneously utopian and apocalyptic. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones, San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury, Woodstock in 1969, there was a genuine belief that something new was possible, that the old structures could be dismantled and something better built in their place. Flower power, make love, not war, all you need is love. And alongside this ran a current of profound nihilism. The Rolling Stones, particularly in their mid to late 60s work, embodied this combination. I Can't Get No Satisfaction is fundamentally a song about the impossibility of meeting desires, demands in a consumer society. Paint It Black is a song about the extinguishing of all meaning. Sympathy for the Devil is an exercise in moral relativism taken to its logical extreme. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were not philosophers, but they were genuinely processing the nihilist mood of their moment. Jim Morrison and The Doors were more explicit about it. Morrison read Nietzsche and Rimbaud. The band's name came from Blake and Huxley. Songs like Break On Through to the Other Side and The End were attempts to dramatize the nihilist break, to push through all conventional meaning and come out the other side. Morrison's persona was self-consciously Dionysian in the Nietzschean sense. The creative destruction of boundaries, the confrontation with chaos. He died in Paris in 1971, aged 27, along with Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and later Kurt Cobain and Amy Winehouse, all dead at 27, all cultural icons of one kind of artistic nihilism, and then the utopia collapsed. By the early 1970s, the hippie dream was over. The Manson murders in 1969 had revealed the darker potential in the counterculture's rejection of conventional morality. The Vietnam War continued. Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were dead. The civil rights movement had gained legal victories, but not fundamental transformation. And the rock stars who had provided the soundtrack for the revolution were dead or dissolving. The generation that had believed in total transformation was left holding the pieces of its own disillusionment. And here's what's interesting. The responsive part of that generation was not to rebuild, not to find new sources of meaning, but to embrace the disillusionment itself. The 70s saw the development of a kind of detached, ironic, post-utopian consciousness that would eventually evolve into postmodern culture. The dream was over. And instead of mourning it, you could smirk at the people who still believed. By 1976, the music that had carried the utopian dreams of the 60s, progressive rock, stadium rock, soft rock, had become a bloated, expensive, self-satisfied industry. The revolution had been commodified, the rebellion had been packaged and sold. Into this walked punk? In the United Kingdom, the context was specific and brutal. The mid-70s were a period of economic collapse, high unemployment, industrial strikes, and genuine social despair, particularly among working-class youth. The young people who formed the first punk bands were not children of the 60s counterculture. They were kids from council estates in London who saw no future. Literally, no future. That was the Sex Pistols phrase. Their single, God Save the Queen, released for Queen Elizabeth II's Silver Jubilee in 1977, was an extraordinary act of cultural nihilism. God Save the Queen, her fascist regime, there is no future in England's dreaming. No future. That's the nihilist position stated without philosophical decoration. Johnny Rotten John Lydon was not a philosopher, but he was processing something philosophically real. The sense that the entire framework of British civilization, the monarchy, the class system, the church, the political parties, was a pantomime, empty, a performance of values that had no actual content, a facade over nothing. The American punk scene was different in tone, but similar in impulse. The Ramones in New York were not as explicitly nihilist as the British punks. They were more cartoonishly violent, which is almost the same thing. Television, Richard Hell, Patti Smith, these were artists dismantling the conventions of rock and roll and of American culture simultaneously. Richard Hell wrote the line, "I belong to the blank generation," a direct echo of the post-war beat generation and a direct statement of nihilism as generational identity, the blank generation. Not lost, not disillusioned, blank. The refusal to fill in the space where meaning used to be. The Clash were more political. They had a Marxist critique alongside the nihilist energy, but even their politics was imbued with the sense that the existing order was rotten to the foundation. And then there was the post-punk scene that followed. Joy Division, from Manchester. Their singer, Ian Curtis, suffered from epilepsy and depression and wrote lyrics of extraordinary bleakness. Love will tear us apart, she's lost control, atmosphere. He hanged himself in May 1980 at 23, the night before Joy Division was supposed to leave for their first American tour. His death became one of rock music's defining nihilist moments. The total, unreserved negative. Punk wasn't just music. It was a philosophical position expressed through aesthetics. The ripped clothes, the safety pins, the deliberate ugliness. These were statements about the bankruptcy of prettiness, the falseness of the polished surface. If civilization is hollow, then polish is dishonest. Better to be ugly and true. And punk's nihilism was generative in ways that pure nihilism usually isn't. Because punk also created new bands, new labels, new venues, new aesthetics, new ways of distributing music. The DIY ethic of punk, you don't need permission, you don't need money, you can make something out of nothing, is actually one of the most life-affirming things in 20th century popular culture. Even when wrapped in the blackest nihilism, that's the paradox of nihilism as a creative force. The most effective nihilist art doesn't just say nothing matters, it says nothing matters, and here's something I made anyway. And the here's something I made anyway is the thing that endures. While punk was happening in the clubs, something equally radical and considerably more difficult to explain was happening in the universities. Postmodernism is the intellectual movement that's most closely associated with nihilism in contemporary culture, and also the most misunderstood. Let's try to be careful here. The roots are in French theory of the 1960s and 1970s, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Jean-François Lyotard, Jean Baudrillard. These are serious thinkers engaging with serious problems, and the problems they're engaging with are broadly versions of the same nihilist problem we've been tracing throughout this whole story. The central postmodernist insight is roughly this. All the grand narratives, the big stories that give human existence its meaning and direction, are constructions, progress, reason, democracy, science, Christianity, Marxism. These are not descriptions of a pre-existing reality. They are stories that cultures tell themselves, and they serve the interests of particular groups within those cultures. They exclude, they marginalize, they enforce. Lyotard, in The Postmodern Condition published in 1979, defined postmodernism as incredulity toward metanarratives, skepticism toward the big stories. This sounds dry. It's actually quite radical, because if you're skeptical of all grand narratives, then you have no framework within which to make truth claims, moral claims, or political claims that stand above the particular and the local. Foucault was specifically interested in power, how knowledge claims are always also power claims, how the categories we use to describe reality are shaped by the structures of power that benefit from those categories. His archaeology of how madness, sexuality, and criminality have been defined and controlled by Western culture over the centuries is some of the most unsettling historical work in the 20th century. Derrida developed deconstruction, a method of reading texts that reveals the internal contradictions and instabilities that every text contains, the points at which its own logic undermines its claims. Every text tries to establish a center, a foundation, a stable meaning, and deconstruction shows how that center is always unstable, always constructed by what it excludes. Baudrillard went furthest. His concept of the simulacrum argues that in contemporary consumer society, images and representations no longer refer to any underlying reality. They refer only to each other. The map has replaced the territory. We live in a world of pure signs, a hyper-reality in which the distinction between the real and the representation has dissolved. His example, Disneyland. Disneyland presents itself as fantasy, as obviously not real, as a magic kingdom. But its function, Baudrillard argues, is to suggest by contrast that everything outside it is real. Disneyland is the decoy. What it conceals is that the whole of America is a kind of Disneyland, a world of pure simulation, in which the real has been replaced by its representation so thoroughly that the real is no longer accessible. The Gulf War of 1991, Baudrillard famously claimed, did not take place. He didn't mean no bombs fell. He meant that the war, as experienced by most people, as a series of television images, a hyper-real spectacle, bore so little resemblance to the actual suffering and killing that was happening that the two events were, in a meaningful sense, different things. This is a deeply unsettling position, and it was highly influential in art, in film, in cultural theory. The Matrix, which we'll get to, is a direct engagement with Baudrillard. Neo's copy of the book, Simulacra and Simulation, is not accidental. Now, there's an obvious objection to postmodernism, and it's a good one. If you're skeptical of all grand narratives, you're also skeptical of the narrative that says all narratives are culturally constructed. The postmodernist critique undermines itself. You can't argue, from within a system of reason, that all reason is socially contingent, because that argument is itself a claim to reason. Postmodernists have various responses to this, some more convincing than others. But the self-referential problem is real, and it's one reason postmodernism has been attacked from both left and right. The left worries that postmodern skepticism undermines political commitment. If all narratives are equally constructed, why fight for justice rather than oppression? They're just different stories. The right worries correctly, in many cases, that postmodern relativism in the academy is philosophically corrosive. The truth is that postmodernism captured something genuine: the exposure of power in knowledge claims, the critique of totalizing narratives that exclude and silence, and then, in its most extreme forms, overreached into a relativism that threatened to dissolve all stable ground. That's the nihilist trap again. Start with legitimate critique, end with nothing. The 1990s were, in retrospect, the decade when nihilism went mainstream, not openly, not under that name, but the cultural products of the decade, the films, the novels, the music, were saturated with a particular flavor of nihilism that was simultaneously stylish and desperate. Start with grunge. Kurt Cobain and Nirvana arrived in 1991 with Nevermind, and the sound and the mood were unmistakable. A combination of pop, melody, and pure fury. Songs that simultaneously embraced and rejected the mainstream, a voice that sounded like it was being dragged through suffering and barely surviving. Cobain was not a philosopher, but he was processing something genuine and generational. He described Nirvana's music as music for teenagers who felt like they didn't fit anywhere, who didn't have the romantic rebellion of the hippies or the political engagement of the punks, who just felt wrong in a way they couldn't articulate. The 90s version of the blank generation, In Bloom, Lithium, Rape Me, something in the way Cobain's lyrics were fragments, impressions, barely coherent at times. And that was right. Coherent lyrics require a framework of meaning. These songs were made in the absence of that framework. He shot himself in April 1994. He was 27. His suicide note quoted Neil Young, "It's better to burn out than to fade away." His wife Courtney Love read the note publicly at a vigil in Seattle, and at the end, she told the crowd, "Don't remember this as a rock show. I want you to look at this as a think about what Kurt said about how he felt, and the things that he did to himself. Don't be that way." That's as close as a rock death gets to a philosophical statement. Then there's Fight Club, Chuck Palahniuk's novel, published in 1996, filmed by David Fincher in 1999. The unnamed narrator is a consumer drone, a hollow product of late capitalism who can only feel alive by fighting and ultimately by embracing destruction. Tyler Durden, his alter ego, his shadow self, articulates a pure nihilist program. Destroy civilization, start over. You are not your job. You are not your khakis. The film is brilliantly ambiguous about Tyler Durden. He's charismatic and he's wrong. His nihilism leads to fascism. His Project Mayhem is a cult, a self-abnegating mob, the opposite of the authentic individual he claims to champion. The film critiques its own premise, but many viewers missed the critique and heard only the liberation. I Am Jack's complete lack of surprise. The things you own end up owning you. Tyler Durden became a cultural icon, which is exactly the kind of contradiction the film was trying to expose. American Beauty, 1999, the same year as Fight Club. Lester Burnham is a middle-aged suburbanite in the grip of a crisis of meaning. His life is comfortable and entirely hollow. He rebels badly, self-destructively, but in the middle of the film's wreckage, he has a moment of perception. He sees a plastic bag blowing in the wind, filmed by his neighbor, and describes it as the most beautiful thing he's ever seen. An entire world brimming with evidence that there's so much beauty in the world. This is a direct engagement with the nihilist problem. The film takes the complete absence of transcendent meaning as it's given, and then asks whether ordinary experience, perceived with sufficient attention, might contain something. Not God, not progress, not romantic love, just the plastic bag, just the thing itself. It's an absurdist answer, Camus in The Suburbs. And the film won 5 Academy Awards, which tells you something about how mainstream this philosophical mood had become. Radiohead were making the same argument in music. OK Computer, 1997, an album about the alienation of modern life, the emptiness of technology and speed and consumerism. The failure of all the stories we tell ourselves. I'm a creep. I'm a weirdo. This is what you get when you mess with us, paranoid android. There's an ironic distance in Tom York's voice that is specifically postmodern, not full emotion, not full detachment, but something in between. The mode of a person who can't fully commit to feeling because feeling requires a framework of meaning they no longer possess. And yet, these albums, Nevermind, The Bends, OK Computer, In Utero, are among the most loved and most replayed records in rock history. Because they communicate something real. Because the despair in them is specific and recognizable. Because nihilism, when expressed with genuine artistic force, stops being abstract and becomes something someone can hold on to in the dark. That's the strange alchemy of nihilism as art. The expression of meaninglessness becomes meaningful. The thing that says nothing matters, matters to the people who hear it. The void, rendered in music, becomes something you can live in without disappearing. The internet changed everything about nihilism, not its philosophical content, which remains what it always was, but its social form, the way it spreads, the way it feels, the communities it generates, the politics it feeds. Before the internet, nihilism was mostly a private condition, a philosophical position someone worked out from books, or a mood someone fell into after a particular set of life experiences. You might find it in the works of Nietzsche or Camus or Sartre, or catch its flavor in the music of Joy Division or Nirvana, but it was something you encountered and then processed, largely alone. The internet made nihilism communal, and that changed it in ways that are still being worked out. The earliest online communities, newsgroups, bulletin boards, early forums were characterized partly by a kind of gleeful cynicism. The internet attracted people who saw through things, who were irreverent, who took nothing at face value. A certain anti-authoritarian, anti-exploitation of pretension culture developed early online, and it had a recognizable nihilist flavor. This crystallized, in the 2000s and 2010s, into the culture of 4chan. 4chan was and is an anonymous image board, launched in 2003, originally devoted to anime and Japanese culture. It became the birthplace of much internet culture as we now know it: memes, trolling, lulz. The culture of doing things for the laughs with no expectation of meaning or consequence. The 4chan philosophy, insofar as it has one, is pure nihilism as aesthetic. Nothing is sacred, everything is a target. Nothing should be taken seriously. The most important thing is to not care, to be so detached from meaning and value that you can desecrate any symbol and mock any suffering without flinching. This looks like Nietzsche's passive nihilism rendered in internet culture. The collapse of all value doesn't produce the Bermensch, it produces the troll, the person who extracts energy from others' commitment to things, who gets a reaction precisely by targeting the things people care about. Lulz is the nihilist position as game. If nothing matters, then making someone angry is as good as any other form of entertainment. Actually, it's better, because it proves their attachment and therefore their inauthenticity, their sentimental belief in something that doesn't merit it. The troll is the pure nihilist of the internet age. And the culture of 4chan made nihilism into a mass practice for the first time. Irony is nihilism's preferred register online. Not honesty, not earnestness, irony. David Foster Wallace saw this coming. In his 1993 essay E Unibus Plurum, Television and U.S. Fiction, he described how a generation raised on television had developed irony as its primary mode of self-defense. Television is saturated with irony, with self-aware commercials, with sitcoms that know they're sitcoms, with the constant meta-commentary that says, we know, you know this is constructed, and we're winking at you. To resist being sold to resist being manipulated by sentiment or narrative, you adopt irony. You maintain the detachment. But Wallace saw that this defense mechanism had become a trap. Irony can tear things down. It's very good at exposing pretension and hollowness, but it can't build anything. It can't generate the conditions for genuine commitment, genuine feeling, genuine meaning. Postmodern irony and cynicism, he wrote, have become our modern age's version of a kind of hip, stylish, unconscious armor. And once you're armored in irony, vulnerability looks stupid, sincerity looks naive, caring becomes embarrassing. The things that most require genuine emotional investment, love, political engagement, grief, art, become impossible to access without going through the ironic filter, and the ironic filter makes them feel smaller. The meme is the natural art form of this culture. The meme began as a unit of cultural information, a concept coined by Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene to describe how ideas spread through culture like genes spread through populations. In the internet age, it became something more specific, a format that combines image and text in ways that are instantly recognizable, infinitely reproducible, and almost always ironic. The best memes are philosophical in a compressed, oblique way. The "this is fine" meme, a dog sitting in a burning room drinking coffee, is a perfect image of passive nihilism. The situation is catastrophic. The response is continued consumption. It's fine. The dog keeps drinking its coffee, fine. The distracted boyfriend, the Drake approval, the two buttons, the expanding brain, all of these are philosophical arguments made in a few pixels and a few words. They're ways of processing the absurdity of the situation, the gap between what we know and how we live, the contradictions of contemporary existence through humor, through deflection, through the one register that doesn't require commitment, and there's something genuine in this. Meme culture is, in its own way, a philosophical tradition, a way of processing the conditions of contemporary life that borrows the visual grammar of absurdism and produces something that people recognize as true. When the "this is fine" meme went viral, it was because millions of people immediately recognized the feeling. The fire is real. The inability to respond is real. The performance of normalcy in the face of catastrophe is real. But meme culture is also what happens when nihilism becomes purely aesthetic and completely loses its bite. When nothing matters becomes a format rather than a crisis. When meaninglessness is packaged into a shareable image, the philosophical force of the original insight is drained away. You process the nothingness and then you scroll on, nothing changes. This is the passive nihilism of the 21st century. Not resignation, but scrolling. Not despair, but mild entertainment. The last man, reborn with a smartphone. There's a more sinister development in the online nihilist tradition that has to be named. In the years leading up to and following the 2016 US presidential election, a coherent political movement emerged from the online nihilist culture of 4chan and related spaces. The alt-right, as it was called, was characterized by a very specific combination of nihilist aesthetics and fascist politics. The mechanism was well documented by researchers and journalists who watched it develop. Young men predominantly, who had absorbed the nihilist culture of the internet, the irony, the detachment, the nothing matters posture, the contempt for sincerity found in the alt-right, a way to combine that nihilism with an actual commitment. The commitment was to a racial and cultural nationalism, but it was always wrapped in irony, in meme culture, in the language of trolling and just joking. This is a very specific version of the nihilist problem that Dostoevsky and Nietzsche both identified. If you tell people that nothing matters, some of them will eventually find something that does matter to them, and it won't necessarily be something good. The vacuum of meaning historically gets filled, sometimes by genuine self-creation, sometimes by cults, sometimes by nationalist movements that promise community and purpose and enemies. The nihilist irony served as both camouflage and recruitment tool. The just joking framing meant that explicit racism and violent language could be deployed with plausible deniability. It's just a meme. You're taking this too seriously. The very nihilism that said nothing matters was weaponized to protect the content that did matter. The actual ideology. Richard Spencer, one of the most prominent alt-right figures in the 2016 to 2017 period, explicitly cited Nietzsche as an influence. He misread Nietzsche in exactly the way Nietzsche would have predicted and despised, taking the Bermensch as a racial category rather than an individual aspiration, taking the will to power as political domination rather than self-overcoming. The same misreading Nietzsche's sister had pioneered 100 years earlier. This is not Nietzsche's fault. You cannot blame a philosopher for all the ways his work has been misappropriated, but it illustrates the danger that Nietzsche himself identified. The void that follows the death of God will not remain empty. Something will fill it. And the person who destroys values without creating new ones is not a free spirit. He's a tool for whoever constructs the next set of values in his place. There's a scene in The Matrix, released in 1999, that is one of the most perfect encapsulations of nihilism in popular cinema. Neo is given a choice, the red pill or the blue pill. Take the blue pill, and you return to the comfortable simulation, the life that feels real but isn't, the matrix of shared illusion. Take the red pill, and you see reality, which is terrible. The film's entire premise is Baudrillardian. The world as we experience it is a simulation, a hyper-reality that conceals the desert of the actual. The human beings inhabiting the simulation are living what Nietzsche would call inauthentic lives, absorbed in the constructed reality, without ever confronting the truth. Neo's awakening is the philosophical crisis of nihilism dramatized as action movie. The Wachowskis put a copy of Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation in Neo's flat for a reason. They were making a film that took the postmodern condition seriously. What's interesting is what the film does with the problem. It doesn't stay in nihilism. It proposes a solution: rebellion, resistance, the creation of a different kind of reality. The film is not ultimately nihilist. It takes the nihilist starting point, the collapse of the apparent real, and then argues for something else, for agency, for love, for the choice to resist even when you know resistance is costly. The trilogy's later installments became less philosophically clear, but the original film remains a remarkable achievement, a blockbuster action movie that contained a genuine philosophical argument about the nature of reality, authenticity, and the courage required to live in the truth rather than the comfortable illusion. The red pill metaphor has since been thoroughly debased by the same internet culture that produced the alt-right in right-wing online communities. Being red-pilled means accepting a particular ideology as truth. This is a complete inversion of the film's meaning. The Matrix's red pill is about seeing reality without consoling fictions. The online version is about trading one set of comforting stories for another. Nihilism, again, colonized and twisted by the very forces it should have dissolved. There's a phrase that's been gaining traction in the last decade among psychologists, philosophers, and cultural commentators: the meaning crisis. The idea, developed most systematically by cognitive scientist John Vervaeke at the University of Toronto, is that Western civilization is experiencing a widespread collapse in the sense of meaning and purpose that used to be provided by religious, cultural, and social structures. And this collapse is not just a philosophical problem, it has measurable psychological and social consequences. The statistics are striking. Rates of depression and anxiety in the Western world have increased substantially over the last several decades, even as material conditions for most people have improved. Loneliness is now described as an epidemic. Social trust, the sense that you live in a community that has your back, has declined. Church attendance has dropped dramatically in the United Kingdom, the United States, and across Europe. Political participation has been replaced by political cynicism. Institutions that once anchored collective meaning, churches, unions, political parties, civic organizations, have hollowed out. And into the meaning gap, various substitutes rush: political tribalism, the intense identification with a political team, not because of a coherent ideology, but because the team provides belonging and purpose, and enemies. Consumer identity, the investment of meaning in brands, in aesthetic choices, in the performance of a life that looks purposeful. Social media, the endless performance of a self for an audience, the metrics of likes and followers as a substitute for genuine recognition. None of these substitutes are satisfying. And the research on subjective well-being confirms this. People in the richest, safest, most technologically sophisticated societies in human history report being less happy and less fulfilled than their grandparents were. This is the nihilist problem in its contemporary form, not a philosophical position taken by intellectuals. A widespread, low-grade existential condition experienced by millions of people who have never read Nietzsche and wouldn't describe themselves as nihilists. The meaning structures have dissolved. The replacement structures are inadequate. And the result is a pervasive sense of emptiness that people struggle to name. Jordan Peterson, the Canadian psychologist who became one of the most controversial public intellectuals of the late 2010s, built his entire public career on this diagnosis. His argument, synthesized from Nietzsche, Jung, the Bible, and evolutionary psychology, is essentially that nihilism is the central crisis of the modern West, that the rejection of religious and traditional meaning structures has left people without the frameworks they need to orient themselves, and that the response must involve a return to meaning-making, to the adoption of responsibility, to confronting suffering honestly rather than fleeing it. Peterson's politics are contested, and many of his positions are genuinely problematic, but the diagnosis resonates. Millions of people, mostly young men, notably found in his message not a political ideology, but a response to the nihilism of their own experience. Clean your room as a genuine philosophical instruction. Start with what's in front of you. Take responsibility for what you can control, create order in the small space before trying to fix the large one. Vervik's approach is different, more academic, less polemical, but he's asking the same question. How do you cultivate the capacity for meaning in a post-religious, post-metaphysical world? His answer involves cognitive science, contemplative practice, and what he calls participatory knowing, a mode of knowing through engagement and embodied practice rather than purely theoretical contemplation. Both of these figures are, in their different ways, doing what philosophers have always done in the face of nihilism, trying to find a way forward that takes the problem seriously without surrendering to it. Here's where we are. 2.5 millennia after Pyrrho suspended judgment on everything, 1.5 centuries after Nietzsche declared God dead, 3/4 of a century after Camus asked us to imagine Sisyphus happy, we are still in the middle of the nihilist problem. The transcendent framework, the idea of a God who guarantees meaning, of a natural moral law, of a cosmos oriented toward human flourishing, has not been restored. The secular alternatives that 19th and 20th century thinkers proposed, reason and progress, socialism and communism, nationalism and race, have variously failed, killed millions, or dissolved into irony. What we have, broadly, are a few responses that have emerged from the history we've traced. The first is what you might call committed engagement. This is the existentialist response, Sartre's, Camus', in a different form Frankl's. The acknowledgement that meaning is not given, but made. That human beings are thrown into existence without instructions, and the task is to choose, to create, to commit. Not to a cosmic truth, but to something real, other people, a project. A set of values that you endorse with your choices, even knowing they have no cosmic backing. The second is what you might call pragmatic reconstruction. This is the position of thinkers like William James and the American pragmatist tradition. Maybe the question, is life meaningful in an objective sense, is unanswerable. But the question, does this meaning framework work? Does it orient me effectively? Does it produce flourishing? Is answerable? And if it works, that might be enough. Not truth with a capital T, just orientation. Just enough. The third is a return not always to institutional religion, but to contemplative and spiritual practice in a more pluralistic sense. The explosion of interest in Buddhism in the West, in meditation, in mindfulness practices, in various syncretic spiritual frameworks, reflects a genuine need for the kind of grounding that secular philosophy has struggled to provide. This is neither naive nor necessarily anti-intellectual. Contemplative traditions have been wrestling with the problem of meaning and suffering for thousands of years. They have tools that philosophy of the analytic tradition has sometimes forgotten. The fourth, and this is perhaps the most interesting, is the artistic response. The tradition we've traced from Nietzsche through the existentialists, through the beats and punk and grunge and postmodern film, the response to nihilism that takes the form of making something. Camus said revolt. Nietzsche said creation. Dostoevsky said love. Frankl said responsibility. The pragmatists said whatever works. None of them gave the definitive answer, but each of them was pointing at something real about what it takes to be human in a world that doesn't explain itself. And the interesting thing, the thing that keeps this problem alive as a philosophical and human question, rather than collapsing into pure despair, is this. Nihilism has never managed to fully win. Even the most committed nihilist, the most thoroughgoing denier of meaning, continues to act as if some things matter. They eat breakfast, they argue with people, they prefer some outcomes to others, they fall in love, they make art, they keep going. There's a famous criticism of the ancient Pyrrhonist skeptics. If you genuinely believe you can't know anything, how do you walk across the room? How do you avoid stepping in front of a cart? You act as if some things are reliably true, as if some outcomes matter. The radical skeptic, in practice, turns out to be committed to a great deal. The nihilist is in the same position. The person who says nothing matters is making a claim that, if true, also undermines itself. And in the meantime, they keep living. They keep caring, even if only about the performance of not caring. That gap between the philosophical position and the lived reality is where most actual human life happens. And it may be the most important philosophical territory of all.